Hi everyone, my name is Selvin and welcome to Selvin Student 101. In this video, I'm going to give you my honest opinion on the second year of Cambridge undergraduate economics. I'll also give a rundown of the modules I did, as well as what you learn in them. If you haven't seen my honest opinion on first year yet, it can be found up here. This will be especially helpful for those in the application process. Let's get into the video. If you're interested in my background, I explain who I am in my first year video and also in this video up here. To summarise, I graduated in July just gone and now I work in investment banking. I make videos giving study advice and on Cambridge University. I hope to make this information available for everyone so people from all walks of life can get into Oxbridge. But that's enough about me, on to the course structure. So second year is made up of 3 compulsory modules and you get to pick one option. I'll only be able to give you an opinion on the module that I did, but I'll go over the options later on in this video. The structure of the year is fairly similar to first year, but I definitely had less lectures in second year. I had 9 to 10 lectures a week instead of the 12 in first year. There are still 4 supervisions per paper, per term, and teaching still only takes place in the first 2 terms. The 3 compulsory papers are micro, macro, and econometrics. My optional paper was advanced maths and statistics for economists. This year, all of my modules were very mathematical, and I was so happy about this because it means I didn't have to write any essays pretty much. However, if you do like essays, there are history and politics optional papers that you can take instead of the advanced maths one. On to the paper overviews. I first wanted to mention that a lot of these topics will sound very confusing to someone who hasn't studied university economics. If you are interested in any of the topics I mentioned in this video, feel free to ask some questions in the comments or send me an email at selvinvlog@gmail.com. Anyway, on to micro. First term micro is all about game theory. Think of the prisoner's dilemma and definitely Google it if you don't know what it is. I think introducing yourself to game theory is a great way to prepare for a Cambridge economics interview. This is because it teaches you a really good way to look at and solve problems. The term starts off with the basics as if you've never learnt it before. You start off with simple games where players move simultaneously. You cover things like Nash equilibrium and strictly dominant strategies. You then take some example games and try to use these equilibrium concepts. The games you look at start to become more complicated as the variables players are choosing become continuous. This would require lots of calculations, but most of the time it was just simple differentiation and solving simultaneous equations. It did sometimes get a bit harder when you have to factor in choices being constrained. For example, players can only choose a number greater than or equal to 0. Things definitely started to get more conceptually tough here, especially when trying to figure out mixed strategy Nash equilibrium. Some of the example games you solve in this part of the course are super interesting. After this, you move on to dynamic and repeated games. A dynamic game is where players make a move at the same time as opposed to choosing a choice simultaneously. A repeated game is a game that is played more than once. In repeated games, it's usually assumed that payoffs in the future are discounted. This is because of the assumption that well-being in the future is less valuable than well-being now. When players repeat a game, the scope of the strategies widens. For example, take a prisoner's dilemma. There is a cooperative outcome that never realistically would get played, and the inefficient outcome which would often get played. This is where both players betray each other. When the game is repeated, players may actually play a grim trigger strategy. This is where a player will choose to cooperate until the other person betrays them. After this, they will then betray the other person forevermore. When players value the future highly enough, grim trigger strategies can actually be a Nash equilibrium. This part on dynamic and repeated games was actually my favourite throughout all 3 years of the micro course. To finish off first term micro, you look at social choice theory. You look at optimal voting rules, such as a majority rule, and Arrow's impossibility theorem. This theorem states that when individuals are choosing over 3 or more options, there is no voting rule that satisfies some optimal criteria, such as no dictatorship. I thought this was quite interesting, but it was hard to live up to the high standard that the earlier parts of the term set. Overall, I thought that this term's micro was really good, and the lecturer explained things very clearly. He was always open to taking questions at the end of the lecture as well, which was really helpful. Because of the lecturer, second term micro was pretty hilarious in comparison. and I'll get to why later. First, you learn about expected utility from lotteries and how this would differ for a risk-averse, a risk-neutral, and a risk-seeking individual. After this, the bulk of the term is looking at ways imperfect information between parties creates inefficiencies. The first one you learn about is moral hazard in a framework where you have a risk-neutral principle and a risk-averse agent. Moral hazard is where one party has more information than another, so even after an agreement is signed, one party can change their actions to improve their own well-being at the cost of the other parties. For example, putting in no effort after your wage is agreed. The next topic is adverse selection. Adverse selection is where you have different types of objects or individuals, and another party cannot recognize which type an individual or object is. Therefore, one type of individual could pretend to be another in order to benefit in some way. Or someone could sell an object and pretend it's a higher quality than it actually is. The last topic of the term was on signalling. This is where, in order to fix the adverse selection, individuals are able to invest in some sort of costly signal to try and show that they are a certain type. For example, you might just study a master's to prove you're clever as opposed to it actually improving your knowledge. All of these frameworks have loads of maths underpinning them. The intuition and chains of reasoning were often quite complex. I definitely thought it was quite difficult at the time, but because I wasn't afraid to ask for help, I did eventually understand it. So don't be afraid to ask for help whenever you need it. The content of this term was very challenging and interesting. However, the lecturer wasn't the best. I do have to say that the lecturer seems like such a lovely guy, but it was very difficult to actually understand what he was saying in lectures. He also made some pretty significant errors within the lectures, and these weren't just typos. It was incorrectly explaining parts of the course. My friend did actually notice these inconsistencies in his explanations, and he did tell him, and the lecturer was very sorry for it. Another reason why the lecturer wasn't so great is because he would often put random works of art, such as these, in the middle of the lecture slides for no apparent reason, and it kind of made the whole process even more confusing than it was. And now, on to macro. The first half of the first term looks at real business cycles. This content uses micro foundations, which are microeconomic models, to explain how macroeconomic variables, such as interest rates, are determined. You first recap the Robinson Crusoe model learnt in first year. You then look at how individuals would split their consumption across multiple periods. You then expand this model to have more periods or infinite time periods, and you incorporate investment, government spending, and taxes into the model. This half of the term wasn't massively mathematical and was often explained using graphs. This did make sense given that the chains of events are quite difficult to explain mathematically. However, the explanations often weren't that clear and the graphs often didn't make sense. The second half of first term looks at unemployment models. First, you look at the simple bathtub model of unemployment, where individuals get a job with some probability or lose a job with a different probability. You then look at the McCall search model, which analyzes whether workers will choose to accept a job this period or to decline the job, receive benefits, and hope for a higher wage in the future. You then look at models of efficiency wages, and in particular, the Shapiro-Stiglitz model. This model assumes that unemployment arises because firms have to pay a minimum wage, which is above the equilibrium wage, in order to prevent workers from slacking off. This term concludes with looking at bargaining models and a derivation of the Phillips curve from micro foundations. Overall, I thought the first half of the term was not explained rigorously enough, as we didn't go into enough depth on the explanations. However, the second half of the term was lectured quite clearly and the content was interesting. Overall, I would say that this first term macro was about a 6.5 out of 10. Second term macro is all about monetary policy under rational expectations. First, you recap the ISLM and ASAD models. You then look at how the central bank will optimally set its policy instrument, such as the interest rate, while being constrained by the Phillips curve. There are also random shocks to output and inflation that the central bank can observe. Then, the timing of events slightly gets altered, so the central bank can no longer observe these shocks. Then, you look at how the interbank rate reaches equilibrium within the interest rate corridor. You then get a brief introduction to financial markets and factors which influence the supply and demand of bonds. This was actually the only mandatory exposure to financial markets in the whole of the economics course. One of the main reasons I wanted to make these videos is so that more people actually had an understanding of what economics was about. There is a massive misconception that economics is all about teaching you how to make money within the financial markets. It may help you understand what's going on within the macroeconomy, but it definitely won't advise you consistent ways on how to make money. Anyway, back to term 2 macro. The second half of this term looks at government policy in an international context. You look at the ISLM UIP model, which determines how the exchange rate is determined within an ILSM style model. You then look at how the exchange rate is determined in the long run. After that, you look at how a floating exchange rate may actually overshoot a desired rate. Finally, you look at some explanations for currency crises. Overall, I really loved doing this course. For some reason, this course was just one I naturally understood better. I somehow managed to get 80s and 90s across the exam questions in this half of the course, and that really pushed up my grade in the exams. I think it was lectured very well, and the chains of events were explained very coherently. It had a great balance of maths and intuition. For anyone studying Cambridge economics, I really think this is a section to look forward to. I actually think the same about first term micro too. Now we move on to the Marmite of economics, econometrics. Econometrics is the use of statistics to describe economic systems. For example, you might want to make a model which can predict someone's wage given some factors such as education, age, race, etc. Some people think it's pointless and it makes no sense, and some people absolutely love it. I definitely sit towards the more loving it side. Econometrics is essentially a continuation of what you learn in the second term of first year statistics. The first term of econometrics focuses on cross-sectional data. This is where you have many observations in one time period. You start off looking at ordinary least squares and how to calculate the estimates when there's only one independent variable. The rest of both terms focuses on regressions where there's 2 or more independent variables. You look at the Gauss-Markov theorem and derive why these assumptions need to hold. You then look at what happens when there's heteroskedasticity in your model. This is where the variance of your dependent variable actually changes as your independent variables change. You then look at what happens to your estimates when you're actually measuring variables with some error. I thought these lectures were good, and the lecturer did explain them very well. I remember that during the lectures, we did often have to take a lot of notes, because a lot of stuff wasn't actually on the slides. Although this was quite tiresome, it did help with remembering the content. Second term econometrics is split into microeconometrics and macroeconometrics. The lecturer for microeconometrics is the same as first term econometrics. You first learn at pooled OLS and fixed effect models and why you should/shouldn't use them. You then learn about probit and logit models. These models are actually a personal favourite of mine, and I used them a lot throughout my dissertation. Again, the content was very interesting and well taught. For macroeconometrics, the focus of the term is on time series. A time series is where you have one observation for multiple time periods. You start off by learning about white noise processes and covariance stationarity. You then learn about autoregressive, moving average, and autoregressive moving average models. Finally, you learn about random walk processes and how to statistically test whether a process is a random walk. The content was interesting, and it is very necessary to understand within economics. However, the lecturer was very difficult to understand and often skipped over important steps. The lecturer was actually so bad that several students, I wasn't one of them, complained about the lecturer during the faculty review. For this paper, you also have to do a 2-week project in exam term. I didn't spend much time on this because I definitely wanted to prioritise revising for exams. The project wants you to do some broad econometric analysis on some topic. The one I did was on yield curves. Lastly, onto my option paper, Advanced Maths and Statistics for Economists. This stuff was so hard, but I do not regret choosing it because it was really interesting as well. First, you go over sequences and limit points. You then learn how to derive various proofs regarding these. Then you revisit constrained optimization. You learn it from first principles again, and what to do in situations when the constraint doesn't necessarily bind. We apply this in really fun contexts, such as being tempted between burgers and salad. Then you revisit how to solve differential equations of various forms. Using these, you learn how to solve dynamic optimization problems. These are problems where you need to pick a function which optimizes your objective as opposed to an individual variable. This stuff was pretty complex, and we applied it to some cool scenarios such as an expanded monopoly model. Overall, these lectures were lectured well and the content was interesting and challenging. The lecturer was always open to answering questions in the middle of the lecture, which was particularly helpful. The second term for this paper was very difficult for me. This term focuses on statistics. You go over sets and what an algebra is. You then go over probability density functions in much more detail. Then you move on to the method of moments and the central limit theorem. You use these to derive best estimators that satisfy certain criteria. Lastly, you dive into some advanced linear algebra and use this in combination with statistics. I found this last half of the term to be especially challenging. Overall, it was lectured quite clearly, and I think I didn't understand it because it was just more difficult for me personally. The lecturer was always open to taking questions, which was helpful. So that's my overall opinion on the economics course in second year. The lecture quality was definitely miles better on average than in first year. To close off the video, I'll talk about optional papers, exams, and my workload. These are the optional modules that you can choose. I can't really give a perspective on these papers, but I know that labour is known for being particularly easy. My girlfriend did do history and philosophy of economics, so I can give you a brief opinion on that. She said that the content was very interesting and the lecturers and supervisors were very good. This paper is particularly important for people wondering how economics came about and why it follows a certain process as it does. Exam advice for this year is very similar to what I said for first year. For micro, focus on the intuition and why you take the certain steps that you're taking. For macro, understand the chain of events that follow a shock and use partial derivatives to help your intuition. For econometrics, I would not prioritize the project and instead prioritize revision. It's really hard to do super well in the project, whereas revision in 2 weeks can make a big difference to your grade. Also, knowing why all of the models are good/bad is really important. Lastly, for advanced maths and stats, I would say do not worry about how hard the content is. The exam questions are pretty standard year on year, so doing past papers will really help with this. Everyone finds the module difficult, so the marking is often lenient. To finish off this video, I'll just briefly go over my workload. Because all of my papers were very mathematical this year, the overall workload was lower because I didn't have to read for essays. The only essays are in macro, and I never really spent much time on these. First term micro did start off fairly simple, so the first 2 supervisions took around 2 to 3 hours. However, as the term went on, there were more questions, the questions were longer, and the questions were also harder. These supervisions ended up taking me about 4 to 5 hours to do. Second term micro was fairly similar in terms of difficulty and time spent. First term macro supervisions were often fairly simple and diagram heavy. These usually took around 2 to 3 hours to complete. Second term macro supervisions were quite a lot harder and took me about 4 to 5 hours to do. First term econometric supervisions weren't too difficult and could usually be done within 2 to 3 hours. A lot of them actually required using a statistical software called Stata. Second term microeconometrics would take a similar amount of time to first term. However, second term macrometrics often took me 4 to 5 hours because the content was a lot harder. Lastly, the first term of advanced maths and stats supervisions took about 5 to 6 hours. They were pretty hard. The second term for this paper was even more difficult and the supervisions often took me 6 to 8 hours. I would sometimes even spend 8+ hours on them and then just eventually give up and hand in an incomplete piece of work. Also, what I found was that in first term, a lot of the supervisions were actually pushed back into the holidays or for the start of the second term. This meant that in the last 2 weeks of first year, I basically had no work to do and I had a super relaxing time. However, this usually will vary by college as it depends on the supervisor's schedules. So there you have it. This is my honest opinion on the second year of Cambridge undergraduate economics. I definitely thought that the content this year was miles better than in first year, and it was my favourite content to learn throughout my 3 years. My next video will be on how to prepare for interviews for all subjects and will hopefully be out in the next couple of weeks. This one will be especially useful. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, a share, and subscribe to my channel. It would mean so much to me. Thanks very much for watching, and see you soon!